Jessica. I'm not. We may run into a situation. We heard this morning my background has to leave early today, so he might jet out. We looked for someone, but it's been difficult. Yeah, he needs to be like before. Yeah. Okay. That's the issue. We couldn't get anybody. There's no That's good. But yeah, we haven't found anyone. Yeah. But I mean, there's been interest from Sierras and sometimes lower income, but they couldn't confirm.
You must be now?
Yes.
I'm great.
Oh,
I'm the new Bill.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Sorry.
You look familiar.
Yeah. Okay. Excuse me. I used to be on the committee up until June.
Okay. Yeah.
When did he become this guy?
This year.
Okay.
This year. Yeah, and I used to work when I was always on the committee and stuff, so we probably.
Okay. Yeah.
I was gonna say, he may have to leave early.
Right.
In fact, I know he does. He
Okay.
has like a White House thing that they switched the scheduling this morning. We couldn't find anyone to replace on
That's
this
all
side.
right.
But generally, like, it's kind of a free-for-all on this
Exactly.
subcommittee anyway, so.
Dana's running late. Should be here soon.
That's okay.
You want to come on up?
Peter, I wish they'd let you have the authority.
Yeah,
You can
I'll do
step.
it.
I can
give a little speech about
The
surf.
chairman has to give you that.
I can talk about surf.
I would.
I can put the power drink in my. I'm gonna call him. It's very unusual for Dana.
So you agree with that?
Yeah, you can go.
Good.
I tripped over him already. No, you're. Dana, I did your opening speech.
He did, it was unbelievable. He did a great one. And he did it in Chinese.
All right. You have to leave it, right?
I will, yeah.
Okay.
Crazy.
It's all right, I understand.
Let's see how fast we go.
Mm.
Won't be that long. Gentleman in the right wants to get back to the World Series. He'll talk.
All right, let's do this. this here. Good morning. The hearing is convened, and I recognize myself for an opening statement. Red China, and I don't hesitate to call it Red China, is the threat of the 21st century. Since its birth as a communist country 64 years ago this month, untold misery has befallen the world's most populous nation. Millions were killed in establishing their Marxist-Leninist dictatorship, and millions have been killed since then. Millions killed, for example, in the Cultural Revolution of 50 years ago, and in the regular repression since. Today, its extravagant claims do not allow for autonomy of belief or systems, unless those systems are within their own control of the dictators in Beijing. It has established a concerted effort against any religion that does not worship at the altar of Mao, be it any flavor of Buddhism, Christianity, or other faiths. The Falun Gong and the Uyghurs have been singled out for special persecution. Some perhaps believe that Mao is a harmless print on a poster or a t-shirt. In reality, Mao joins the ranks of Hitler and Stalin as the 20th century's worst character in butchering millions of his fellow citizens. One of our witnesses, Steve Mosher, in his book, Hegemon, China's Plan to Dominate Asia and the World, quotes Mao telling a stunned Khrushchev, quote, "So what if we lose 300 million people? Our women will make up for it in a generation," end of quote. Lest one think Mao a dusty old historical anachronism, foreign policy columnist Zakaria, if I got that right, in the Washington Post, October 24th, and I quote, "It appears that the party is choosing older Mao methods of crackdown, public confessions, and purification campaigns." What exactly does that mean? There are millions of prisoners of conscience today in labor camps in China, according to a new report by the Center for International Media Assistance for the National Endowment for Democracy. I quote, "China's media environment remains one of the world's most restrictive in 2012. Crimes such as rumor mongering on the internet can land one in indefinite detention. Authorities censor and harass international reporters or deny their visa applications or renewals. Physical attacks on foreign media members are a disturbing and a growing trend. And their long reach extends overseas." One of our witnesses today, Steve Mosher, had his promising academic career in the United States as the first American social scientist allowed to carry out fieldwork in Mao's China. It was derailed over some outspoken criticism of China some years ago. Today we look at China's external posture towards its bordering states. That's the purpose of this hearing. But China has menaced, threatened, and even attempted to absorb its neighbors, notably Tibet and Taiwan, and has clashes with virtually every bordering state. The subcommittee will examine China's threatening maritime and territorial claims. For those tempted to dismiss the thought of a threat as being an overstatement, let's not forget that China expanded its landmass by 50% when it invaded and occupied Tibet in the 1950s. Notice the disturbing pattern. if China borders you or borders water that is anywhere near you, let's say the Pacific Ocean, it will assert every conceivable claim to wrest your sovereignty or territory from you, including threats, provocations, stunts, protests, and gunboat diplomacy, all while whining in the international forums that is available to it about its treatment, about how they're being treated. This is to say nothing of its routine conduct in international affairs, industrial espionage, piracy, forced organ transplants by religious practitioners that it has murdered, IP violations, currency manipulation, and even bad and deadly dog food, I might add. In the New York Times Magazine's Sunday, October 27th, in an article entitled A Game of Shark and Minnow, the author writes, and I quote, China is currently in disputes with several of its neighbors, and the Chinese, having become decidedly more willing to wield a heavy stick, there is a growing sense that they have been waiting for a long time to flex their muscles and that time has finally arrived. Again, Farid Zakara writes that diplomats have worried that China has been circulating new maps of the region in which a previously dotted demarcation line that China claims in the South China Sea, instead of a dotted line, it now is a solid line. This is far from a new problem. Yet the situation has not reserved reserved the scrutiny that it does seriously deserve. After a trip to the region, I reported to the House in late 1998 the pattern of Chinese naval bases in the Spratlys, meaning the Spratly Islands, shows an encircling strategy of energy-rich islands and an intimidating military presence along the vital sea route. I argued then the U.S. government must end its silence about the Chinese military buildup in the Spratlys. Multiple administrations and secretaries of state have unfortunately thought since then that we cannot disturb our second largest trading partner, or that the situation, they would hope, will improve on its own. Worse yet, the New York Times Magazine piece reports, and I quote, the Americans pointedly refuse to take sides in the sovereignty disputes, end of quote. The magazine correctly notes China's behavior as it becomes more powerful, along with the freedom of navigation and control over the South China Sea lanes, which are being threatened, will be among the major global political issues of the 21st century. I would argue that to believe China's apparent expansionism is accidental or inevitable sells our adversary short, and we helped create this monster, this threat, by granting a permanent normal trade relations with what was then and still is the world's worst human rights abuser. This is something we never did with the Soviet Union. We never granted most favored nation status with the Soviet Union, and that's why Soviet communism went down and why dictatorship in China has emerged as a great threat to all of us, not just its own people. There's a long-standing deliberate strategy in China to expand, provoke, challenge, and ultimately dominate the region and then the world. Stephanie Klein Albrandt, the director of the Asia-Pacific programs at the United States Institute of Peace, said, and I quote, "Nothing in China happens overnight. Any move you see was planned and prepared for years, if not more. So obviously, this maritime issue is very important to China," end of quote. Our witnesses today paint a bleak and compelling picture. Steve Mosher has written prolifically on our topic today. Perry Pickard describes China playing a far more sophisticated game of statecraft than what we are playing. And Rick Fisher states succinctly, we are in a Cold War with China. Far from minding its own business, as a good neighbor, China, and that's what they would do if they were minding their own business, China instead is an international menace with grand designs. Marxism may be on its last ash heap of history, but Marxist-oriented one-party rule, tragically, has characterized China for more than 60 years. Our Pentagon's announced strategy of a strategic pivot to Asia will be hollow if we are not clear about the main threat in this theater. Its maritime claims are dubious. Its grand designs must be opposed by the free world if peace is to be preserved. And with that, I would ask my ranking member for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I'd like to thank you and thank all of our witnesses for appearing today. I'll make note that one of the witnesses is Dr. Peter Sanby Thomas, a visiting professor from the University of Massachusetts in my own district. And I appreciate your being here today, as I appreciate all the witnesses for being here today, and look forward to your testimony. We're joined by Representative Lowenthal. Welcome. The United States has a clear national interest in promoting the peaceful resolution of maritime and other territorial disputes in Asia. Since World War II, the United States has played the leading role in maintaining peace and stability in the Pacific. It's therefore appropriate that the United States have an active and direct role in resolving the disputes in the South and East China Seas. Yet, we must be sure that our policies and actions do not inadvertently heighten regional tensions. China's maritime and territorial disputes with its neighbors date back to conflicts of the 19th and 20th centuries. Most were seriously exacerbated by the tensions of the Cold War. In addition, most of these disputes have deep historical roots and are fought with bitter emotion. Achieving their peaceful resolution will not be easy. It's therefore essential that the United States continue to support a collaborative process free of aggression, coercion, or the threat of force amongst all parties involved. This will require patience, perseverance, and deft diplomacy on our part, even as tensions in the region continue to escalate. The United States has made clear that we'll uphold our security commitments and treaty allies and partners in the region, and we'll make sure that we're strong in stating that. Now is not the right time to change that tack. In that regard, continued U.S. support for the development of a multilateral code of conduct between China and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is essential. A binding code of conduct would considerably reduce tensions in this region. I applaud the administration's effort to ensure freedom of the navigation rights in this region, as well as new initiatives to help allies and partners strengthen their capacity to patrol and administer their territorial waters. I am, however, concerned over the impact that across-the-board budget cuts and related uncertainty will have on these important programs and U.S. projection in the region. I look forward to hearing our panelists' views on the immediacy of the threat posed by maritime disputes and the effectiveness of the U.S. policies in the region, along with your own thoughts on how the United States might more effectively press claimants to peacefully resolve their differences. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Joined by Mr. Lowenthal, but Mr. Stockman, do you have an opening statement?
And just briefly, to our detriment, in the 1940s, we ignored Asia and didn't pay attention to it. And I think that was obvious when Pearl Harbor happened. It caught us, well, theoretically it caught us by surprise. And now, again, we seem to be putting the Asia problems on the back burner. When we visited with the Prime Minister from Japan, he expressed concern that America is losing its interest in Asia and its real will to defend Asia and our allies, such as Japan. I also remember in 2008 the Olympics where one young man got up and said, screamed out, this is in Tiananmen Square, we're a nation of slaves, where is America? And he was hauled off, and the reporter glibly said, well, we don't know whatever happened to that young man. I think it's high time that we take more of a look at what's going on in Asia and be more sensitive and be more alert. I think down the road, by not following that path, we're going to end up in big trouble. And it'll be very much like 9/11, where we wonder what happened, where were we? It'll catch us off guard. Why didn't we connect the dots? Well, the dots are all there. We need to connect them, and I appreciate these gentlemen coming forward today and actually connecting the dots, and this is going to be part of the record that we're going to have. So when we look back on it, we can look back at this record, and a lot of you will probably say, we told you so. So I appreciate you coming out today and giving your testimony, and I yield back the balance.
No, I'm just pleased to be here.
All right, well,
I'm pleased he's here, too.
all right. Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. And our witnesses, we have some very significant witnesses today, and what I'm going to do is ask, with permission of the panel, that we place their very lengthy backgrounds and their credentials into the record. And so we have, if we could just put their bios in the record, I'm just going to announce them as, and then we will proceed. And I would ask that you would be giving us about 5 minutes, and then the rest of your testimony for the record, and we'll have some questions and answers. So first, we have Mr. Perry Pickard. He's a PhD and a retired intelligence officer, and I guess a very continuing intelligent person. So, Doctor, could you please proceed, and then we will introduce the other witnesses, and your lengthy bio will be made part of the record.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
In fact, it'd be better if you get it closer to you.
Get it closer to me.
Yes.
I'll get it working. Thank you very much for inviting me. That should do it.
There you go.
But I wonder how we can wake up my PowerPoint, which has been put to sleep. I will start. They should be able to push a button and turn on the computer, but I don't know what happened.
Has someone hacked into our system?
Yes, the Chinese are here already and shutting me out. But I'll begin anyway without the PowerPoint. I can run through it fairly quickly.
It is showing up on a television set in the Spratly Islands. Right now.
The term Great Game was coined in the early 18th century to describe the strategy and tactics to protect India, the jewel of the crown of the British Empire, from a rising Russia. Beginning with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the United States has advocated substituting universal international organizations and the rule of law for great power competition and war. At the UN this fall, President Obama, at the UN General Assembly, stepping into one of the great games of this century, into the forum of the great games of this century, said there is no great game to be won. In this century, the United Nations systems provides the normative and institutional structure for relations, as well as the language of diplomacy. While Russia, China, and the United States have never fought a war against each other, the United Nations has proved the legal rationale and cover for actions of their military and clandestine services. This morning, I will survey the strategic landscape in Asia, focused on arising China's territorial claims and the implications for the United States. China and Russia view the world from a long-term perspective of the Russians as a chessboard, and the Chinese play Go. to work here.
There, you got it.
I got it up, but not connected to this yet. There we go. Now we got it now. Now it should work. Point it over there. I will use the traditional Chinese game of Go, which is played by placing stones on a board, black and white stones. They are not like chess pieces which can go anywhere, but they essentially capture territory. Territory in this game is really the space between points, and the Go pieces are placed on the intersection. There we go. I'll go back. Traditional China is at the center of its own universe, and over the centuries has grown from a very small tribe in central China to the outside. Its relations were handled as family relations, and the outlying princes were ruled as if in a family, with the close relatives closer and the further relatives further away. But on the outside were the barbarians, who were ruled like dogs, being rewarded and punished with bones, rewards, and sticks. The Ming Dynasty extended throughout the whole of East Asia and established a system of tribute whereby the rituals of kowtowing and coming to the center. Today, the center is the UN General Assembly in New York every year from October until December. Now, if you look at this map, we'll go to look at the Senkaku Islands, which are the first territorial dispute. You'll notice they can hardly be seen on this map. That exaggerates their size drastically. This is what the Senkakus look like in picture. There are three small little islands. In Go terms, this would be played as a three-sided game of Go with a space. If you have to find, this game is almost completely finished. The contesting space out there now are the blank spaces between the lines, and those are points, so that there is no real territory as ground. It's territorial space. This thing is hard to. This is the Taiwan looks at from this perspective. You can hardly find Quemoy and Matsu on a map, but you can see the Taiwan off of the islands, a distance of the straits away. As a Go problem, this is the Google map of Quemoy and Matsu. It's on Google because it's Taiwanese territory and therefore is open to the. But it is, as you will see, completely surrounded on three sides, leaving only one open. In Go terms, this is called Atari. When you bring someone into position where they are about to be surrounded, you're supposed to inform your opponent that they are an Atari. And generally, it's not necessary to put another stone there because you don't need to finish that off. You've got that territory able to be captured by one stone. These are fuel air explosives shot from artillery rounds in Syria today. The reason I say welcome to Grozny is that with this method, after Putin got tired of having an inconclusive battle in Chechnya, he used fuel air explosives to essentially level the town in 2000. Fuel air explosives are like napalm, which is blown by artillery shells. It spreads out and then is ignited after the cloud is lighted. That not only makes a big explosion, but it also sucks out the oxygen from the area. And of course, they could use fluor explosive to blow Quemoy off the face of the earth in 2 seconds. These are China's maritime claims in the South China Sea. In this case, the empty spaces you see are the specks out in the middle of the lake, which are the essentially disputed islands. The far line shows where the disputes are. Viewed as a go game, you will see that these are the 5 parties about to contest over a little spot in there. The Chinese way of handling this will be to do it bilaterally, waiting for weakness on the part of one side, then taking the space. This is the Chinese latest surface-to-air intermediate range ballistic missile. It has a fuel-air explosive warhead and is called the aircraft carrier killer because, in fact, if it hit right on the aircraft carrier, it would be able to kill everyone on it and surround, and that would be the end of it. Of course, it's really just a big scud, and the Russians and the Chinese do not use single tactics, they use mass tactics. So they would fire 8 to 10 of these. This is the range of the missile, the intermediate ones, and that shows the range of all the other. In the game of Go, this would essentially put the entire area that we are talking about under the range of non-nuclear ballistic missiles that can be fired. And they're mobile, so we have no clue where they are. And a response is preempted by the longer range potential of nuclear missiles, as you can see, can hit the United States easily. This is the Tibetan Plateau, and you can see on this that the center, the one little corner of Tibet, is the source of all of the rivers of Asia: India, China, Vietnam, Burma. The Chinese tactic with respect to this is to dam the part of these rivers up in China. So at any time they can simply turn off the water for Southeast Asia or let it out, causing a flood. They have a series of dams in China, and there are quite a few dams that are built in cooperation with the other countries which they are sponsoring. The India-China border is the farthest wide. This is an area where the Go strategy is to seize the high ground. It's not really necessary for them to have forces on the area, and if they were at Asha Kim, they would be up at about 14,000 feet, needing oxygen equipment. So nobody ever actually sits up there, but they have skirmishes all the time. Now we'll turn to the UN system as a place for the competition of the Chinese worldview. At first, you can see that the Russians also have a view of the UN. That's the UN flag with a hammer and sickle in the territory that they used to think they controlled. This is the way the Chinese view the UN system as they expand their influence over it. Now I'll go through the specific organs of the UN. But I'm going to drop the Go analogy because it's a little complicated. The General Assembly is what I call liar's poker. If you look on there, we see Khrushchev with his boot on the table. He, of course, actually had 2 very fine Italian shoes on at the time and brought that along only as a prop. He didn't take off his shoe and pound it on the table. And Deng Xiaoping announced his strategy for the next 20 years. Getting over, I'll be through in 2 seconds here. The Security Council is strip poker. You go in thinking you with one thing, and by the time that the Russians and Chinese get finished with the resolution, you get another. The Shanghai Cooperation Council was created by the Chinese and the Russians for Central Asia. You can see its logo is essentially the trace of Mongols. The Mongols. I call this the KGB officers and agents traveling crap game. the Law of the Sea Convention has been signed by China and Russia, and the U.S. is not a member, so we don't participate. This will show you how the UN system allows you to stretch to the Pacific, where you can see the Law of the Sea pioneer investors, the Chinese, the Russians, the French, having staked out territory at the bottom of the ocean. The competing claim is the Clipperton Island claim, which the U.S. has based on the economic zone. Finally, my conclusion is how do you capture Kim's gun, which is in Lahore, Pakistan? And the answer is to recruit the llama, as you see he was sitting there, because you control the space by having the person who is controlling the person on the space. And this was Kipling's statement about the great game, the final bottom line. When everyone is dead, the great game is finished, not, as we've seen, the American view that it's no longer, it's been subsumed into the UN system. Thank you.
We are going to now go to the last witness because he happens to be the witness who is invited by the ranking member, and I'd like Ranking Member Keating to introduce his witness today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't go into great detail because time is precious today, but I do thank Dr. Sandy Thomas from joining us today and to testify on these issues. I do think his own expertise will be self-evident, and rather than delay with an introduction, I'll just introduce Dr. Sandy Thomas. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Chairman Robacker, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and emerging threats on this topic of vital national and geopolitical significance. Sort of to frame the discussion, I think it's important to consider the question of whether China's recent behavior, both maritime and beyond, should be construed as a threat. And in sort of making that point, the purpose is to draw attention to the fact that China is emerging as a regional and possibly global power. And so in such a context, it's necessary to determine what types of behavior and conduct are justifiable and commensurate with this increasing power. And when you clarify this, then that provides a benefit in terms of assessing China's behavior in terms of what's threatening and what is, say, permissible. If we turn to China's military capabilities, it's clear that they have expanded rapidly in recent years, and that's aided in large part through a concerted effort to allocate increasing budget spending towards their military. And if we look sort of within this, you can see that the People's Liberation Army's Navy capabilities, they've been notably expanded. And you've seen sort of significant milestones in terms of China's first aircraft carrier, sort of plans for a second one, sort of details indicating that they have other sort of high-tech equipment, sort of guided missile destroyers, et cetera, et cetera. One of the aspects of this is that it's not always entirely clear how to determine the veracity of such reports, which in and of itself can be perceived as an issue in terms of transparency. And sometimes that leaves a void that gets filled by increased speculation. But regardless of that, I think it seems clear that the Navy is rapidly developing and is on course to be the dominant maritime power in East Asia. The time frame's not exactly clear, but it seems within the next 10 to 20 years. There doesn't appear to be another rival that is capable of sort of challenging it. The only sort of reasonable one would be Japan, but it's obviously sort of hobbled by constitutional restrictions. At this point, I think, though, the focus is often sort of solely on the hardware, And that is, of course, important, but it's also important to consider sort of how sort of seaworthy China's vessels are. That's not exactly clear. These things aren't obviously battle tested. They also have a limited schedule of sea operations. And I think another aspect to consider is, say how the sort of quality of the mariners that China has. Again, that's something that can be put down to a lack of practice, certainly when you compare it to, say, the U.S. naval capabilities. Nevertheless, the expansion of naval capabilities has raised concerns, particularly over China's intentions. And this has led to, different analysts drawing different conclusions. Some make the point that this expansion definitively reflects an intention to exert regional dominance. And I think that it's not obviously something that can necessarily be ruled out. Certainly, why is China investing all this money in certainly equipment if it doesn't intend to use it? That's certainly the prevailing logic. But I think the more likely explanation is that China's strategy, certainly in the near to medium term, is primarily defensive in nature rather than offensive. If we look at the region that it's located in, it's confronted by, say, a number of conflicting and competing challenges. I think it's a region that's filled with, say, historical grievances. You have competing powers, such as Taiwan. Australia also has a naval fleet, and Japan is, impressive capabilities, even if to a degree limited. You also have, say, unpredictable actors that are in the region. And so the conclusion that I would draw is that China's naval expansion would appear to be more geared towards ensuring their own territorial security, as well as ensuring that sea lanes of communication remain open for commercial interests. And while this assessment does run counter to the prevailing orthodoxy, and it's clear that in the past few years a label of assertive has been attached to China, particularly with regards to the East China and South China Seas. And while the nature of this claim, I think, is, say, ambiguous, sort of elastic, if you will, isn't clearly grounded, I think you can look that China's behavior in these situations has not significantly deviated from past practices. You can argue that there has been provocation on the part of others, so other actors need to be taken into account. And I think you can also, make the point that, China has been, say, more forthright in pressing its own claims, but I don't think that you can argue in both cases that the claims are significantly new. Generally, China uses a designation of core national interest to determine if it regards a particular territory as non-negotiable, and that's not been the case on both the Senkaku Diaoyu Island dispute or the dispute in the South China Seas. So because of time, I'll sort of wrap up and just say that in terms of implications for the U.S. and these regional developments, the particular concern seems to be, say, a security point of view. I think that you can make sort of arguments about sort of the assertiveness of China's behavior, but regardless of that, I think the dispute between China and Japan appears to be the more serious. I don't think that the intention is to engage in conflict, but it's clear that there are increased Chinese incursions, increased Japanese responses, and so that increases the likelihood or the potentiality for some sort of conflict, and obviously that then brings in the U.S. and its security obligations. In terms of the South China Sea, it seems that negotiated compromise is more likely and possible, and something that the U.S. should certainly press for. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll have questions for the panel as we finish our testimony. Next, we have Rick Fisher, who is a senior fellow at the Asian Military Affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, as well as a lengthy bio as well, which will be submitted for the record. Mr. Fisher, you may proceed with your testimony.
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I would also like to thank you for this privilege to offer testimony to aid your deliberations. I would also like to offer my compliment to your leadership in looking beyond Europe and Eurasia to examine concerns with China. Just 2 weeks ago, I was called to address a NATO parliamentary committee on Chinese military modernization. And my experience at this meeting was that indeed there is great concern, especially when considering how China is pursuing its territorial claims in a way that is increasing the chances for conflict, either accidental or by design. I would just offer that just this past weekend, the Japanese Air Force had to scramble 3 times, 3 days in a row, to intercept threatening Chinese bombers that were conducting coordinated ship, submarine, and aircraft anti-ship exercises south of the Sakishima Islands, which, if the Chinese ever succeed in grabbing the Senkaku Islands, will be the next meal on the menu. In my testimony, I try to describe how China is building a force to achieve regional dominance. I estimate that absent a countervailing effort by the United States and its allies, that China could have this regional dominance by early in the next decade. This dominance is going to be expressed not just in hardware, expansive space control, missiles, expanded regional nuclear forces, 4th and 5th generation aircraft, naval forces with multiple aircraft carriers, a large amphibious projection capability. But China will practice and will have the skills to use this hardware to achieve its aims. Japan, of course, as I mentioned, is the target of the moment. Since the Japanese government moved to purchase the Senkaku Islands in the summer of 2012, a move which we've just found out was designed to try to ameliorate conflict with Beijing, the Chinese have put on a expanded paramilitary campaign to try to intimidate Japan into making concessions. It's not going to work. And my prediction is that the Japanese are going to rearm significantly because of this pressure, and we will have a much more dangerous and more well-armed East China Sea by the end of this decade. But China probably believes that it can have more success in the South China Sea. It is succeeding in the last year in pushing the Philippines away from areas near its economic exclusion zone. Mr. Chairman, as you pointed out in a recent New York Times article, Chinese Coast Guard ships are trying to dissuade the Philippines from supplying men on a beached LST on Second Thomas Shoal. In the future, China is going to be building the means for global power projection, and it's going to be able to weigh in on other countries' territorial disputes. I would just offer that this year I was able to find out by visiting arms shows that Argentina and China are considering the co-production of a Chinese fighter, a fighter that could be armed with a new Chinese hypersonic missile at a speed at which you can't shoot it down. China fully supports Argentina's claim to the Falklands. By the next decade, by the end of the next decade, will China be able to send aircraft carriers or amphibious groups to respond to a British attempt to defend the Falklands again? I conclude by noting that while the Obama administration's recent pivot to Asia over the last 2 to 3 years has been welcome in the region. The momentum that the administration has built up is being undermined significantly by uncertainty surrounding our ability to pay for new programs to make good on our pledges and continue to ensure pledges that we've made to our allies, our military allies. We're not able to afford aerial exercises that we've planned. We're threatening to cut back our number of carrier battle groups and eliminate whole types of combat aircraft. This is very disturbing, and it will only encourage the Chinese to press harder. I believe we can deter China. I think we have it within our capability to encourage our allies to join a regional information sharing network, radar, space assets and the such, and then eventually tie this network to new ballistic missile capabilities, short range and medium range systems that perhaps we share with our allies, intermediate range systems that we deploy ourselves. If we can prove to China that, like on Dr. Pickard's Go board, that if they use their Navy, they can lose their Navy, then we can sustain deterrence and suggest to our Chinese friends that violence will not pay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that testimony. We now have Stephen Mosher, Director of Population for the Population Research Institute. And again, all of our witnesses have lengthy resumes that will be included in the record. Go right ahead, Mr. Mosher.
Well, I commend the chairman, Chairman Robacher, and Ranking Member Keating for holding this timely hearing. As Rick just mentioned, there have recently been renewed incursions by Chinese assets into Japanese territorial waters around the Senkakus and the Ryukyus in general. And I would note that a top Chinese general has actually questioned the legitimacy of Japanese claims, not just to the tiny Senkakus, but to the entire Ryukyu island chain, including Okinawa with its U.S. military bases. And I, knowing the situation in China, knowing that people rarely speak out of turn without being punished, I take such warnings, such suggestions by Chinese generals as tantamount to diplomatic announcements. Seemingly everywhere we look, we see evidence of China's increasing aggressiveness. And I think it's past time to ask, I think as the former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld did many years ago, why this ongoing military buildup when China faces no external threat? Why these provocative acts? What, after all, does China want? I think to suggest that Australia somehow poses a military threat to China is vastly overstating rather underpopulated Australia's desire to defend its own territorial waters from a country which is now is in the process of trying to annex the entire South China Sea, which is a territorial claim roughly equivalent to as if Nazi Germany had declared before the outset of the conflict in World War II that it owned the entire Mediterranean. I mean, it's an extraordinary territorial claim. In May this year, Chinese troops intruded nearly 12 miles into Indian territory. It withdrew only after India agreed to withdraw its own troops from the area. And so this high-altitude border dispute continues to simmer. The Indian Prime Minister is going to China, to Beijing in a couple of days, apparently to sign a border cooperation agreement on Chinese terms, which I believe is what one Indian analyst called an exercise in coercive military diplomacy, or bullying in short. China is sowing new seeds of conflict by continuing to expand its military presence in the South China Sea, where I know, Mr. Chairman, you've been personally. Last year it seized the Scarborough Shoal, which lies off the coast of the Philippines, by force. When the Philippines protested, the PRC reacted by saying that the Philippines' claims were illegal and that it would never agree to international arbitration over the shoal or any other claims. Now that's important because the Philippines is now seeking UN assistance against China, and we, least the current administration, seems to be extremely reluctant to back U.S. allies in the face of Chinese aggression. We have only said, in the person of the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, that all countries have a right to seek arbitration to resolve competing territorial claims. We have not vigorously backed the obvious claim of the Philippines to territory which lies very close to its own homeland. I see China's behavior as reflecting something fundamental about the Chinese party state. A government that rules its own people by brute force, we all remember Tiananmen, is naturally inclined to treat its smaller, weaker neighbors the same way, especially if they were, as in the past, tributary states of China. I think this accounts in part for the palpable disdain with which it treats the other claimants in the South China Sea dispute, including Vietnam and the Philippines, both of which have stronger claims to the Spratlys and Paracels than does China itself. I would also add to the death toll that you, Mr. Chairman, mentioned at the outset of this hearing in your remarks. To the death toll caused by the one-party dictatorship that rules China, we must add the 400 million eliminated by China's infamous one-child policy. I was an eyewitness to women being arrested and forcibly aborted at 7, 8, and 9 months of pregnancy in China in 1980, and those kinds of atrocities still continue today. Only the continued presence of U.S. assets, the U.S. 7th Fleet in the Far East, I believe, stays China's hand. The China has actually suggested that we withdraw to Hawaii and cede everything west of Hawaii to China. There's little doubt, if that happened, that China would then occupy the remaining islands in the South China Sea by force, ejecting the garrisons of other nations, and begin to demand that ships transiting its quote-unquote interior waters would first seek permission to do so or run the risk of being boarded and quarantined. This is actually now the official policy of the Chinese government. As of last November, Beijing announced last November that Chinese authorities will board and seize control of foreign ships that, quote, illegally enter, end of quote, the area that it claims is part of the province of Hainan. That is the entire area inside the 9-dash line. Now, seizing ships in international waters is an act of war under international law. I believe that China has been clear about its intentions in this regard. We could talk about continued double-digit increases in the PLA's budget. We could talk about other new capabilities, but I'm really less worried about China's capabilities than its intentions. I am concerned that China, which lacks transparency in terms of its military budget and in stating its intentions, is only emboldened by our careful and measured and nuanced and oftentimes too quiet response to acts of aggression. I think that emboldens the Chinese leadership. An open society relies on comprehensive and accurate information to inform both its citizens and its allies of the common threats that they face. I believe we need another commission, and I realize there are a couple of commissions that serve to alert us to happenings in China now, but I believe we need another commission that focuses specifically on China's intentions. There is a precedent for that. I served on the U.S. Commission on Broadcasting to the PRC back in the 90s, which specifically looked at the question of whether or not we needed a radio-free broadcast system broadcasting into China news and information that was denied the Chinese people themselves by their state-censored media. And the answer that we on the Commission reached was yes, we did need such a broadcasting service, and it does yeoman work today. I believe we need another commission to look specifically at China's intentions. It would review, evaluate, and if necessary, correct any understatements that are reached by other intelligence agencies. Such a check on the current administration consensus on China would be invaluable. Such reviews proved to be such during the Soviet era when a number of independent commissions reviewed Soviet military capabilities and intentions. This way we would get a timely, independent assessment of China's military intentions, because in a few years it will have the hardware it needs to undertake aggression both in Asia and in different parts of the world. It is vital that we understand now, before it gets that hardware, how they intend to use it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of my witnesses, all of our witnesses today. And what we'll have now is just some questions and answers. All right. And that's good. All right. As my staff recommends, I would suggest that I'd like well, first of all, let me just note this for the record. Our subcommittee focuses on Europe and Asia, Central Asia, but it also, in its definition, talks about emerging threats. That's why we are here today. This is part of a discussion on what some of us believe is an emerging threat to the peace of the world and the security, thus, the security of the United States of America. And from the witnesses today, I would say that we do have one voice of disagreement, and we will get into that discussion, and we're very happy to have you with us to promote that type of discussion, because, of course, in countries like China, they don't have people on the other side of issues when they're being discussed, than the other side of issues that the state has taken a stand on. I'd like to ask the panel very quickly if you might mention any specific weapon systems that China is building that threatens America's naval or air or space assets. And maybe just go down the line just very quickly. Dr. Pickard, can you think of a weapon system that they are developing that you might warn us against?
I think specifically the sea power aspect is under the envelope of strategic conventional weapons, and the East Wind system of these are essentially huge Scud missiles that can operate on from the bases in China to essentially any of these things which are being disputed can be blown off the face of the earth without even leaving China. So
are they accurate enough to be?
They don't have to be accurate. You just shoot 20 of them, and they will knock off a whole corner of the universe. I don't know if you've ever seen an arc light strike by B-52s. They take out a whole grid square of a territory. This is a Scud tactic. It's using mass attack on a particular place, and you have 20 missiles all shooting at the same thing. And these islands are in specific areas where you try to have naval forces are simply deterred from using that space. If it escalates to anything below local conflict, and the trouble with each of these areas is they cannot be held as territory because they can be obliterated.
Mr. Fisher?
Mr. Chairman, I would call to your attention the system of weapons that the Chinese are developing and beginning to deploy, starting with a dual-use space program, both manned and unmanned, that provides targeting and communications and data links for missiles like the anti-ship ballistic missile, new supersonic anti-ship missiles that are being carried today by Chinese bombers, future hypersonic anti-ship missiles, not to mention what they'll be putting on their aircraft carrier. As soon as that starts service in about 2 to 3 years, it will have a fighter that is about as good as our F-18 Super Hornet. Submarines are being built like dumplings, and they're good, and they have air-independent propulsion so that they can stay underwater for a long time. This is just what's going to be hitting us in Asia. In the next decade, China will have the wherewithal to project force around the world, both mechanized airborne and mechanized amphibious infantry supported by aircraft carriers, and an even more robust space architecture.
Mr. Mosher?
Well, I believe Mr. Fisher has hit on the key points here, and I would just say that China has rapidly upgraded the capabilities of its Navy, and it has now a Navy, the largest force of major combatant submarines and amphibious warfare ships in Asia, and many of them are first rate. China is constructing its own GPS satellite network. It has a ground-launched anti-satellite capability capable of taking out our communication satellites, and is developing a space plane, the Shenlong, which may have military capabilities.
Oh, here's your chance.
Sure.
Are these not a threat,
Well, I think they've been
Dr.
fairly
Thomas?
comprehensive. I think the big concern is sort of, as I noted, the guided missile destroyers in terms of how that would impact U.S. Navy operations, particularly if you're providing support, whether they could take out aircraft carriers. That's something that seems to be developing or being developed. How close to production, I'm not entirely clear though.
Let me just note that one of the sad aspects of the answers that we just got is that the source of research and development for many of the weapon systems that you're talking about are the American taxpayers. I mean, is a panel, or anyone in the panel doubt that many of the weapon systems that China is developing are based on information that they have stolen and hacked and gotten from American industry and sometimes actually stolen from our own government operations. Is there any doubt about that? Or would we comment on that? Yes, sir.
Acquisition of foreign technology is essential to the Chinese military research and development process. From the opening of our relations with China, Mr. Chairman, China has deployed tens of thousands of engineering students to the United States to study at our best schools, and largely for the purpose of taking that information and experience back to China to apply to weapons programs. I can offer numerous citations of experts that worked for NASA, went back to China, and are now helping to develop space planes which will be used for military purposes. When China was developing its current fourth generation fighter, the J-10, it had to develop new composite materials for the airframe. It actually came to California and had those composites validated by an American company. Went back to China and put them into production. They work very fine. Thank you very much.
I think that says it all. Thank you very much, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given our focus as a committee on Europe, and Mr. Fisher referenced NATO, I'd just like to know how our European partners are responding to the recent developments in Asia, and should we be asking them to do more? And if so, what do you think the contributions they could bring might be?
Mr. Keating, it's a very important question. For 20 years, the United States government has been engaged with our European allies over the issue of arms sales to China. The European Union established an embargo, as did the United States, after the Tiananmen massacre. The Europeans have unfortunately defined and redefined their embargo to allow more and more dual-use technology to go to China, and this is going directly into the People's Liberation Army. Eurocopter, for example, has a new a full-up helicopter co-development program to include the engine with the Chinese helicopter industry. This will be a new, modern, state-of-the-art 6 to 7 ton helicopter. The Europeans tell me at when I see them at numerous arms shows that no, this helicopter will never go into the PLA. But every other European helicopter that the Chinese have co-produced, and there's about 4 or 5 of them, they have all gone into the military. So, and naval engines, all Chinese non-nuclear submarines and new combatant ships use European design naval engines, largely German design engines. I just found a citation a few weeks ago that the Chinese shipbuilding industry has purchased a state-of-the-art Spanish ship design three-dimensional software. And this is already helping the Chinese to develop better combat ships. When we find these examples, we should be quite insistent with our allies that this is not helpful, that this is actually creating problems for them, because the sooner that China has the ability to wage war against Taiwan, which it's still building tremendously to conquer Taiwan, perhaps early in the next decade, attack Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, or enforce its outrageous and expansive claims in the South China Sea. Those could all possibly engage American forces in support of allies and detract, either in the short term or very likely also in the long term, to assist our European allies from threats that are growing against them as well.
So you mentioned that there might be compromise because of their sales. Did you note, when you gave your address, was there any concern from any of those countries about what was occurring, through China's actions?
Oh yes, great concern. Many questions, and the information that I was giving, surprisingly, was viewed as new. Many of the parliamentarians from our NATO ally countries who attended this conference simply did not have an understanding that China was at a point where it was threatening to start and cause wars. Our annual PLA military power report that the Pentagon has been issuing since early in the last decade really needs to be translated into multiple languages. It needs to be upgraded. It needs to be published as a book with pictures and charts. Yes, that may look like the old Soviet military power report of the 1980s, but that's what our friends and our allies are looking for from the United States. We have to identify these threats in order to ask and encourage our allies to take them seriously and then respond appropriately.
And I think all our panel has addressed this one way or another, but just to have a concise, answer to this, if I could just go across our panel and just ask, how immediate is the threat for the China's maritime and territorial disputes? And could you just, in very short language, describe it as either short, medium-term risk of armed conflict? What is the time frame, and how real is it? If we could just quickly go. I just want to get a zero in on that.
I'll start at this end by saying that it's not, all of these disputes are essentially traps for points of opportunity for regional and local conflicts, one-on-one with small countries that cannot respond to them.
So short, medium?
That's present right now all over the place. It's happening every day, and their strategic overview of that is to protect to make sure that we do not interfere in that process.
Mr. Fisher?
In the last 3 weeks, Japan has threatened to shoot down Chinese unmanned aircraft that would violate Japanese airspace. A Chinese unmanned aircraft basically did that in early September, and it was intercepted. The Chinese have responded just this past weekend that the shoot down of a UAV by Japan would be an act of war. This act of war could actually transpire at almost any time, Congressman.
Short term. Mr. Mosher?
The threat is immediate and ongoing. That's why Japan is building now its own marine expeditionary force to protect the the Senkaku Islands and also the Ryukyus. It never felt the need of doing that before. It does now. So Japan feels an immediate threat. It's in the neighborhood, and I think we ought to look to Japan's response to calibrate our own.
Mr. Samby Thomas?
Yeah, I think the likelihood of conflict is higher now than, say, it was a year ago. In terms of the immediacy, it seems that it's the potential for provocation on both sides is there, but I still don't think that war will break out, I guess.
No, but there's consensus among all four of you that there could be conflict in the short term that is escalating, and that's an interesting point that we should bear in mind and seek out our Europe allies and our partners in Europe so that there's a better understanding of that. So I thank you very much. That was very helpful. And for the purpose of the rest of the hearing, Representative Lowenthal will be assuming the ranking membership, and I thank him for doing that. And thank you, because I think that last series of things put a time frame on some of the urgency of what we're facing. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And Mr. Lowenthal, who represents a district next to my district there in Southern California, and he also now represents a city that includes the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and these ports are, of course, tie us to China, and events in China are thus very significant to Southern Californians, and we welcome his participation today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do agree that we have figured out ways between you and I to settle our disputes peacefully. Not that we have that many. I just want to follow up on that last question about really the level of tension in terms of the maritime disputes and what really specifically at this moment should be the U.S. role. And I'd like to start with Mr. Samby Thomas and then ask all the panel, what now, where do we go now for the United States in terms of this? If tensions have escalated, what specifically should we be doing today? Besides holding this hearing and learning about what is really going on and not denying the existence of the problems that are going on.
Well, in terms of the East China Sea dispute, it's unclear necessarily on, say, China's strategy, but obviously there's this issue of energy around the islands. I think the islands in and of themselves don't really hold a huge amount of value, right? They're sort of these barren rocks,
right, that's
uninhabitable. So there's energy, but that seems that could be something of joint negotiation. There's been negotiations in the past to jointly develop these, so that could be resumed. In terms of the Chinese position, it seems that the decision by the Japanese government to purchase the islands maybe on the one hand sort of didn't change how the islands were administered, but on the other hand maybe indicated that it kind of changed the status quo. And so the Chinese actions in that context, maybe I think they have a strategic value. The Senkaku Islands form part of this first island chain, and the Chinese incursion seemed to be sort of testing Japanese resolve on this. I think they're testing both Japanese resolve, how far can China can kind of break this chain, does it have an opportunity to do so, and how strong is the resolve between the U.S. and Japan. So would the U.S. defend Japan if there was a sort of conflict was to break out? I think on the latter part, the U.S. has reiterated its obligations under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, so that seems fairly clear. The difficulty really resides in sort of the Japanese and the Chinese, and they have various competing sort of interests and aims. They have different audiences that they're playing to. There's sort of, obviously in terms of, say, Chinese domestic politics, negotiation with Japan is not so easy, and particularly I think some of the politicians in their statements have linked the Senkaku Island back to sort of Japan's sort of wartime actions within China. And on the Japanese side, it seemingly is the China threat is being sort of amplified to sort of push forward demands for increases in naval capability. So I think that's what contributes to the volatility. In terms of the U.S., I think it's sort of gone as far as it can. I'm not sure that it. I think it's important to indicate that the U.S. would intervene, and the likelihood of conflict, I think it's an immediate threat, but I wouldn't expect conflict to break out other than through a sort of accidental issue. I don't think the intention of either side is to engage in conflict over this, but that's something that could change, obviously, going forward.
Well, I would have to disagree, at least in part, with that assessment. I believe that China's leaders, since the Tiananmen massacre, have deliberately stoked patriotism. They installed in the early 90s a patriotic education program in the schools so that from kindergarten through college, the Chinese history textbooks are full of great Han Chinese chauvinist sentiments, talking about how China was once a great nation and will be again, how the Japanese, who are called in colloquial parlance in China dwarf barbarians, which is not a happy phrase, have periodically invaded and ravaged China, and they use this anti-Japanese sentiment in order to reinforce their own control over China. The appeal of communism in China has long vanished, but the appeal of patriotism still has a strong hold on the Chinese people. So in part, these aggressive acts enable the Chinese leadership to say to the Chinese people, we are in the process of building a great and glorious China, equivalent to those in the Song, the Tang, the Ming dynasty. And you see how we're asserting Chinese rights overseas in the Senkakus in the South China Sea and elsewhere. We're going to bring these tributary states to heel. I happen to believe that without the calming presence of U.S. assets in Asia, that Chinese open aggression would have already occurred vis-a-vis the Philippines, for example, last year in Scarborough Shoal, were it not for the possibility of U.S. intervention, the Chinese might well have sank the Philippine patrol boats. Instead, they drove them off with water cannon. Last year, they cut the towed sonar arrays of Vietnamese survey vessels. They were trying to survey waters immediately off Vietnam's coast, but that's part of the extraordinary territorial claim made by China. They cut the survey cables and drove the Vietnamese ships back to port. They might have behaved even more aggressively were they not worried about the possibility of U.S. intervention. The same thing with regard to their last November claim that they had the right to intercept, interdict, and board ships in the South China Sea. We guarantee freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation. And as long as the U.S. remains engaged in Asia and reassures its allies that we will be there in the event of conflict, China gets that message loud and clear. So I think for us to equivocate or not state clearly what our position is encourages aggression, and that as in the 1880s when we faced a different kind of threat, we can achieve peace in Asia through strength, but certainly not by telegraphing weakness.
Congressman, I would like to answer your question by also saying that if we do nothing today, then we risk the danger in the short term of having our allies possibly defeated in skirmishes around the Senkakus, in the South China Sea, but that this is simply unacceptable. If our allies are undermined, if they lose confidence in their alliances with the United States, they have alternatives. And in my opinion, they will develop their own nuclear missiles. Japan, perhaps, followed by South Korea, followed by Vietnam and Australia. It could happen rather quickly. And after that, the prospect of a skirmish being one that escalates to a nuclear exchange that we're drawn into is real. So, sir, I would suggest that, as Stephen suggests, we have to be very clear to the Chinese about what we consider unacceptable behavior. And we have to support our friends and allies. We have to make clear that we are there to back up our alliances, that we are there to support our longstanding friendship with Taiwan. It's by selling them the systems that they need to deter war. Because if we fail to do this, as Stephen, I would agree completely, we are inviting conflict, and those conflicts very well could consume our own. Thank you.
Well, I think the most important things is to maintain relationships over a long period of time with the peripheral states, especially ASEAN in this case, because that was developed as a counter-alliance to China 30 years ago and still is. The problem is our relationships bilaterally with those countries are not really integrated into a comprehensive strategy. They're only one-on-one meetings, photo ops at a certain time, wearing some kind of ridiculous outfit in a photo op. Our relationships have to go beyond that into long-range ties with the countries, which, especially in the cases where we don't have those ties, like Vietnam, it is important to build them, and in places where we've had long ones and are essentially neglecting them now, such as with Thailand, which is a very big and important country, cutting back on our military relations, which I know we are doing, is a bad sign, and therefore we should spend a little money on the relationships as more important than on hardware, which is essentially really checkmated by the strategic missile systems that are being built.
Well, thank you very much. I thank our witnesses today and my colleagues. I'll just do a summary and then we'll bring this to an end. Let me just note we live in a changing world. This is a very changing world. My father flew the first DC-3s into Shanghai in the final months of the Second World War. And he always told me how he was sent there from the Philippines, where they'd been flying up and down the Philippines. And when they landed, their job was to make sure that that airport was available so that we could now have input into Shanghai, which had been under Japanese occupation. And things had broken down there, and so they were sent in. And when he got to Shanghai with a number of DC-3s and filled with Marines and equipment to set up communications, etc., an American presence in that city, the first thing he did was get off the airplane and grabbed what appeared to be a Chinese official or someone who knew what was going on and said, "Where is the home of the Japanese commanding officer?" And he said, "Oh, it's that big house over there." And then my father lined up his Marines and marched up to the house and knocked on the door, and an older man, Japanese man, answered the door. And my father said, "This house is now being confiscated by the United States Marine Corps. You will vacate within a half an hour and not come back." My father was 24 years old, had never been out of North Dakota before World War II, and that's what kind of influence we were exercising throughout the world. And I just saw a thing about last night. I was up and watching a documentary and on the Battle of the Bulge, and he had all these 18 and 19-year-old Americans there facing the German army. And America, since that time period, has spread out from the heartland of our country to be this huge force in the world. We no longer have that ability. We no longer can afford to be the dominant force on the planet militarily. we don't have the capability of having our young men go to a different country and knock on the door and tell the aggressor to get out of the building, or to send 18 and 19-year-olds as cannon fodder to stop a invasion by a totalitarian force into Europe. We were mentioning we're not spending as much money. Well, if we do, we have to borrow it from China in order to spend it. What does that tell you? The world is a changing situation. We have to come up with a strategy that works to promote peace in the world and also freedom in the world, which I believe peace and freedom go together. They're both sides. They're two sides of the same coin, and that's why we need to talk about these serious challenges. And I believe that as we develop a strategy for the future, we have to understand the threat in Asia and the threat that China plays to our planet. First to the Pacific and to our planet. Let me note when we talked, or the testimony we had today on the expansion of Chinese missile and space power, the expansion of submarine fleet, Chinese submarine fleet, and the utilization of Chinese air power expanding by utilizing Western technology, perhaps Argentinians, etc. This means that we have a challenge, but at the same time, we have our limitations. All of this has to be be given a lot more thought and a lot more discussion as we have had today. Let me just note that when I hear that the Germans are working with the Chinese to develop certain weapon systems, I can't help but not be so upset that some of our people might be listening in to the German government's conversations. I know Mrs. Merkel may not like to hear that, but the fact is that our intelligence systems need to keep us informed of the development of this type of threat. And finally, let me just say, we don't live in a world where a 24-year-old young man goes and confronts a Japanese general who is engaged in an aggressive act in China. We live in a world instead that you have an aggressive posturing by China and a bullying of its neighbors by a government in Beijing that is the world's worst human rights abuser. I think the most important statement made in today's hearing was that a government that so tortures its own people, so represses them and murders them, how can we expect them to treat other neighboring weak countries any better than they treat their own people? And that does not forebode us or to warn us what does. The fact is, where they treat their own people, they will treat the rest of the world. And Japan, we need to make sure Japan, which can be a very positive force, that we need to not be afraid of Japan anymore. And we need to make sure that where we cannot afford to balance off this expansion of Chinese power and military power in the Pacific, we can't afford that. But we can afford to work with Japan, who, with their contribution, can help balance off that shift in power and thus help ensure the peace of the world. We should be working with the Japanese for that end. With that said, this hearing is now adjourned.